from the military. I'm your host, Kevin Bemmel, and we are here every Tuesday at 10 a.m. Pacific time to talk about military doctrine, military history, the practices of great military leaders, all by way of um, translating them into things that we can do in our business and professional lives to improve them. And this is all part of my effort as a veteran to take some of the things that I learned either when I was in the military or have read as a historian and offer them to you, my fellow citizens, for your benefit. I've said this many times. The military spends an enormous amount of money training service members, developing doctrine, etc. And this is one way that we can give back to you for your support. So today I'm talking about the subject of advance or retreat. And I'm going to be using as my example the Battle of the Marne, which took place during the beginning of World War I in September of 1914. So this was several years before the United States entered the war. I think, just as an aside, one of the interesting aspects of World War I is it in many ways looms so large in American history, and yet we did not get involved combat-wise in World War I until April of 1917, and combat operations in World War I ended in November of the following year. So we were only involved for about 18 months. And of that, U.S. combat operations were even shorter, about 6 months. So the fact that we declared war in April, we had almost no army to speak of, roughly 100,000 men, and I think around 6,000 officers thereabout. And at the time, and even in the beginning of World War I, armies were, close to 1 million men in some cases. That was the case for the French at the Marne. And the Marne is known as the miracle of the Marne, or at the Marne. And I think as we talk about this, you'll begin to see why. So setting events up a little bit. I'm not going to get into why World War I got started. That is a rather complex subject. Generally, we're told that a Serbian terrorist assassinated the Archduke Ferdinand of Austria, and that started World War I. While that was kind of a precipitating event, there was a long lead up to World War I, and it involved more than this one incident. But in any event, the Central Powers in World War I were essentially Germany and Austria. Okay, you may say, well, wait, what about Italy? No, Italy was not allied with Germany in World War I. Neither was Japan, by the way. And the Allies were, in the beginning, primarily England and France. Now, France was the major combatant. It had essentially the largest army on the continent. And the other sort of combatant was Belgium. I'm talking about them in the beginning of World War I. Now, Belgium was actually a neutral country in all of this. And in fact, it was, part of Germany's initial plan of attack was to sweep through neutral Belgium to attack France. And the idea was, so there was something called the Schlieffen Plan. Schlieffen was a general in the German army, and he came up with this idea that Germany would sweep toward France part of its right wing would sweep through Belgium, which was thought to be, they're just going to walk over Belgium. It's no big deal, even though Belgium was a committed neutral. And so, Germany making war on France, they were bound by treaty to not go through Belgium. And it was because Germany violated that Belgian neutrality that the UK, Great Britain, ended up coming into the war in defense of Belgium. But because France was being attacked by then, the age-old rivalry and animosity between England and France was cooling, and the French and the British became allies, kind of for the first time. So here you have this situation, and there's a wonderful book about this, very well known, called The Guns of August, by Barbara Tuchman. And it really talks about that first month, a little bit more than a month, of World War I, primarily in August of 1914. So Germany, under the Schlieffen Plan, decides to attack France, again, through neutral Belgium. And the idea of the Schlieffen Plan was that the Germans would move so quickly that within 35 days, they would conquer Paris and destroy the French army and just summarily win the war. And that was gonna be it. Bang, bang, done. And the reality is that Germany came very, very close to succeeding. So opposing the Germans were primarily the French, under Ferdinand Foch. And they had something called Plan 17. Now, interestingly enough, you would think Plan 17 would have been a defensive plan. It was not. It was also an offensive plan. And I talked about this in a show, I think, a couple of weeks ago. The idea, the sort of central idea of the French army was to attack, to be on the offensive always. Crâne was the French word, basically, always be attacking, always be on the offensive. And so you had this clash between the Germans and the French. And the reality of the situation was the French did not fare well. And although the Belgian army, small as it was, under the King of Belgium, actually was able to delay the German offensive much more so than the Germans and even the French anticipated. And the Belgians had a series of forts and fortifications and such, and it took massive artillery barrages on the part of Germany to destroy these fortress lines, and in doing so, it slowed up their advance. And so the idea of the Belgian army and of the King of Belgium was they would defend these fortresses until they became indefensible, basically, and then they would pull back to the next line and to the next line. But by delaying the German move through Belgium, they sort of threw a wrench in the overall Schlieffen Plan, and in the meantime gave the British time to land the British Expeditionary Force, really essentially in Belgium, to shore up what was the left wing of the French army. Now, I mentioned a minute ago that this was really kind of the first time that the French and the British operated together, and there was a lot of suspicion between the two armies about working together. And the initial combat phases did not go well. So the English commander was very reluctant to engage in military operations at the certainly at the order of the French military, and indeed he was very careful to maintain Britain as its own army, and there was a tremendous lack of coordination between the two that the Germans were essentially able to exploit. And at different times, so if you can imagine army, if you have a solid line of army, so you can't get around what are called their flanks, right? But once you have one army, pull back farther than the other, now you create a seam through which the attacking army can advance, and that becomes a problem for both, right? Because if I can get in between and behind, this army that's in front, that's a problem. But now I've also exposed this army to a flank attack, so I can attack this army from the rear, but I can now attack this army from the side, and now they've got to turn to defend themselves, and that makes them vulnerable. Now they've turned their flank to the front lines, and you see how a battle can go wrong. So this was the kind of thing that Ferdinand Foch was dealing with. And all along he's saying, attack, attack, attack. And the reality was the French were not able to hold the Germans. And so toward the end of August, Foch finally recognized that they would have to retreat essentially and regroup. And so he did do that somewhat. And at the same time, he reorganized the French military. So he created an army under Gelini, who was recalled to duty. He was essentially a retired general. He had fought in the Franco-Prussian War. He was recalled to duty, and he was charged with commanding the French Sixth Army and defending Paris. Now, the idea of defending Paris was not a universly held idea. So there were senior leaders in the French army that felt that that Paris should not be defended, that they should withdraw essentially behind Paris and let the Germans move in and take it. But in the meantime, the government would relocate out of Paris, and so the government wouldn't fall, and so it would be somewhat of a Pyrrhic victory for the Germans to take Paris, because in the end they would have gotten the city, but they wouldn't have overthrown the government. They wouldn't have destroyed the French army. So it was, this controversy was going on in the beginning of World War II. And Gelini, the leader of the French Sixth Army, recognized that he was really kind of being put on the spot, because on the one hand, he was being told, here's an army and defend Paris, but at the same time, units from his army were being requested to shore up the other armies that were still actively facing the Germans. So he was getting, kind of a mixed message, if you would, about really how important was it to save Paris. And it finally got to the point where Foch sort of had to fish or cut bait, as we say. So his right was weakened. If there's a famous line about this, I'm gonna read the quote here to make sure I give it to you right. So he sent a message to essentially the French government saying, my right is driven in. That's where the Germans were pushing most strongly. My center is giving way, meaning that they weren't going to be able to hold off much longer. Impossible to maneuver. And then he ended the message by saying, situation excellent, I am attacking. Now, you can imagine, as his right is collapsing and his center is in imminent danger of collapsing, the idea that this is a great thing and so now he's going to attack makes no sense at all. And of course, this was part of what was driving this idea that the French army needed to retreat. But Foch decided that the only way to essentially defeat the Schlieffen Plan, and it's not clear that he necessarily knew it was the Schlieffen Plan per se, but in any event, to stop the German advance, the only way to do that was to turn the tables and attack them, rather than trying to set up a line of defense that the Germans just couldn't break through, because the Germans would be surprised by his, in essence, turning the tables on him. And so, excuse me, on September 2nd, Foch launches this, battle, what became known as, I'm sorry, not December 2nd, September 5th, Foch launches what becomes known as the Battle of the Marne. And the battle lasted for 7 days. And in the end, by attacking, Marne was able to fight the Germans to a standstill, and hence began what most people know about World War I, which is this trench warfare, this horrible sort of killing grounds where you had forces on one side entrenched and forces on the other side entrenched, and you had this zone in between called no man's land, filled with shell pot marks and barbed wire and all of the this situation where if you wanted to attack your enemy, you had to send sappers through initially to either blow holes through the barbed wire, or you had to send men forward to cut through the barbed wire. Meanwhile, artillery is raining down on them, and horrible killing fields. In the Battle of the Marne, the French had an army, as I mentioned at the beginning, of almost 1 million men, about 980,000 men. I mean, by historic standards, that is just an enormous army. The British had another roughly, I think, 100,000 soldiers involved far on the French left wing. And in the end, again, the idea of advancing in order to stop this attack worked. But it really was somewhat of a miracle, because the Germans just appeared to be invincible at that time. It just seemed like the Schlieffen Plan was going to work, and 35 to 40 days after Germany started combat operations, they were going to conquer the French, and it was going to be, a very short war, and Germany was going to prevail. And in the event, you can see that the war stalemated essentially in September of 1914, and it didn't end for another 4 years. And it really took the United States getting involved, bringing tremendous reserves of manpower to the fight. Now, just to sort of wrap up the story a little bit, it's an interesting footnote that although America at the time was a tremendous industrial power, the U.S. contribution to materiel in the war, in World War I, was very little. So although there were grandiose plans to build, I think it was 20 or 24,000 aircraft, in a 6 months or a year or whatever it was, almost none were actually built. The U.S. had very little artillery that it could bring to the fields, no tanks, which became a new weapon in World War I, machine guns, no. So the U.S. Army actually fought primarily with French and British materiel. What the U.S. Army brought was people, because France and Great Britain had just been bled dry by World War I combat. and the just tremendous number of men who were killed, maimed, wounded in these killing fields. And if you've ever watched one of my favorite TV shows, Downton Abbey, so it takes the time period it covers includes World War I, and you see some of the results of it. It's very true historically, and almost an entire generation of British men was killed or wounded as a result of World War I. And there's a one of the characters, one of the daughters of Lord Grantham, wants to get married, and she starts dating a man who's almost, or maybe is as old as her father, who was wounded, but at least he was, alive. And her father does not think he's a suitable match because he's so old and he's wounded and all that kind of stuff. And she turns to her father at one point and says, "All the young men that I knew are dead. And who am I supposed to marry? What am I supposed to do?" And again, there's a lot of historic accuracy in that. So the impact on French and British society, and German society as well, by the way, of World War I, in terms of just the number of people killed and wounded, was tremendous compared to the United States. And so going back now to our key topic for today's show. So do you advance or do you retreat, right? And the Battle of the Marne would seem to say that all things being equal, you should advance. And you might want to take that lesson away, but I'm not sure that that's exactly what the Battle of the Marne teaches. It is the fact that Field Marshal Foch took a risk, and that risk paid off. But we shouldn't mistake the idea that merely because his risk paid off, that therefore we should always take that risk in our businesses and professions. So I've got my notes over here because I want to make sure I give you these ideas accurately. So the factors in favor of retreating that Foch presumably considered were, first of all, tactically, the French army was in a very precarious situation. And the weight of experience was that the Germans were likely to break through and take Paris. And if they did take Paris, even if they didn't capture the government, and the government was basically, planning to decamp from Paris, nonetheless, from a morale standpoint, it would be a tremendous hit. And not just for the French, but for the British as well. So one of the things the French had to do was show the British that being our ally is worthwhile, right? So, if they had lost Paris, right, the shining jewel of France, that would have been a tremendously negative blow to French and British morale. So that's one issue. By the way, there would also have been a huge boost to German morale. Again, even if the government hadn't been taken in Paris, the idea that the Germans had taken the French capital, it's like, woo-hoo, look what we did, and look how we did it so quickly. So preventing that could have, that would be a good reason for retreat. And by the way, if they did even retreat behind Paris and declare Paris an open city, that would have removed the propaganda victory from the Germans, right? Because the French would basically be saying, look, we're regrouping behind Paris. We're making Paris an open city. If you go in there, we're essentially letting you go into the city. And if you go in there and start, bombing it or killing our citizens or such, indeed, the disapprobation of the world would have been on Germany because, as one might imagine, Paris was a well-known city. Okay, so that was one factor arguing in favor of retreat. The other was saving French troops, French combat units, the French army, to fight for another day, right? So the idea of standing and fighting in the face of what was a superior German military operation, it could have spelled absolute disaster, right? Part of the Schlieffen Plan's one of the Schlieffen Plan's objectives was to destroy the French army. So, if they had stood and fought, and a lot more French soldiers had been killed, so then even at that point, even retreating might not have helped because there might not have been enough of the French army left to mount any kind of further defense, let alone to mount some kind of counteroffensive at the appropriate time. So it might have been smarter for Foch to preserve his forces and basically keep them to fight another day. Now, on the opposite side are the factors for advancing, in other words, against retreating, and they somewhat mirror the factors that mitigated in favor of retreating. So, first of all, by advancing rather than retreating, if the French were successful, as it turned out they would, it was not looked as just a victory, but a massive victory. That's why it became known as the miracle of the Marne. It was a massive victory. They prevented the taking of Paris. They showed their military mettle, as they say, and turned what looked like certain defeat into victory, even though in the end it was really just stalemate. Okay, so it wasn't like the French turned around and pushed the Germans back into Germany. Not at all. Not at all. What they did is they essentially fought them to a standstill. But because of Foch's audacious decision, the Marne became a great victory and a rallying cry. And I think Foch recognized that if he was able to pull this off, that would be the case. So that's number one. Number two, by advancing rather than retreating, he would instill morale or reinstill morale. He would, reinstill morale in the French army and hopefully instill morale in what the French perceived as a British army lacking in cran. And there was probably a lot of truth to that. The British commander was not a particularly aggressive fighter. And so the idea of saying, okay, we're attacking and, you come with us, British, otherwise you're going to be left behind, right? And you're going to look, cowardly, right? So in essence, Foch forced the hand of the British. And again, I think Foch knew that if he was able to attack and turn the tables, not only would that stop the German advance, but it would be a huge morale boost for his army to go back on the offensive and fulfill what they saw as kind of their destiny, this idea of that was central to Plan 17, even though the plan itself didn't work. And then finally, it essentially forced the British to come to terms with coordinating with the French. So again, and I mentioned this a moment ago, if the French had decided to attack while the British retreated, that would have been incredibly embarrassing for the British. And I think Foch understood, even at that early date, that he needed more than just the 100,000 men of the BEF, the British Expeditionary Force, if Germany was going to be defeated. And so he had to find some way, in essence, to get the British on board. And it's, getting someone on board with retreat isn't necessarily the best way to create a tight unit, because people are afraid, people are withdrawing, or soldiers are withdrawing, that sort of thing. But by taking this audacious move and essentially demanding that the British become part of it, he was really creating a situation where they became true allies in their objective of first stopping the German advance, and then eventually, as the years wound by, eventually defeating the German army and winning World War I. So that this then how do we take this lesson and use it in our businesses and our practices? Well, we may be working on, let's take something basic, some kind of large sales initiative. Okay, one that comes to mind is the famous New Coke debacle, right? When Coca-Cola decided that to compete more effectively with Pepsi, they had to change their decades-long formula for the flavor of Coke, because Pepsi seemed to be more highly desired by younger generations, and so they created New Coke, right? Well, it became obvious very soon after New Coke was launched that the consumers did not like it. Right? I mean, I think most consumers, certainly this is the way I felt, was, if I want to drink Pepsi, I'll go drink Pepsi. I drink Coke because it's Coke, right? And because it's not as sweet as Pepsi, frankly, right? So Coca-Cola, the Coca-Cola company, had a very fundamental decision to make. Do we retreat or do we advance? Right? And they had several of the same issues that Foch had. So first of all, they had hyped up their people that this was going to be a turning point for Coca-Cola, and instead it was a disaster. So what did they do? If they continue to go ahead trying to promote what looked from pretty much the beginning to be a disastrous new project, what impact is that going to have on the morale of their people who are fighting what appears to be a losing battle? Okay. Or, do they keep fighting knowing that they're going to break through, and they, continue to pump up their people in the face of what looks like sure defeat? That's essentially the situation that Foch was in. Okay. What do they do about Pepsi? Because remember, just like the French, they were not operating in a vacuum. They were operating against a very powerful enemy, the German army. So as Coca-Cola was going through this debacle, it wasn't like Pepsi was just sort of sitting back and going, oh, we'll just kind of watch this, right? Pepsi is actively looking to take advantage of Coca-Cola's troubles. And so, they're going on the advance and basically saying to consumers, if Coca-Cola is so unsure of itself that it has to copy us, what does that really say about Coca-Cola? See, you might as well drink the original Pepsi, right? And so, in essence, Coca-Cola was facing being encircled by Pepsi. Coca-Cola, for all of time, basically was the number one cola in the United States. Pepsi was always the number two. and Pepsi was looking to overtake Coca-Cola. So would moving forward just further give Pepsi an opportunity to encircle Coke and become the number one cola? I don't know, right? Um, Whereas if Coca-Cola acknowledged the mistake that they had made and essentially, took the humble side, they could make a mea culpa to their consumers, to the people who drank Coke, and say, oops, we made a mistake. We shouldn't have done this. And in essence, by retreating from New Coke, they could regain their footing. They could gather their troops and sort of reform them to make a new assault in the cola wars. And in the end, in this case, Coca-Cola decided retreat was better. So they pulled back from New Coke and they essentially reintroduced original Coke, calling it classic Coca-Cola. And so they pulled back and then they eventually regrouped and moved forward again. And fortunately for Coca-Cola, when by essentially admitting their mistake and coming back with the original formula, their consumers rallied around them, and that saved the day. So I think as we look at our businesses when we're launching some kind of initiative, right? If it goes well, then great, we keep pushing it. But if we encounter some kind of resistance or debacle, at some point we're going to have to face the question of, do we keep pressing on, or do we retreat, regroup, and look for a new line of attack? And I will say, in my own business career, I think one of my tendency is always to keep pushing forward, keep pushing forward, keep pushing forward. And there were times I probably would have been better off if I had, tactically or even operationally retreated, regrouped, and looked for a new way to attack a problem or expand my business, rather than, ceaselessly beating my head against a brick wall and getting nowhere. Now, I will say that sometimes the economy intervenes. And in my case, of my original company, real estate company, there was essentially a recession at the very end of the 1980s and the very early 1990s that forced me to pull back. And while I still didn't want to, I had no choice. But that pullback allowed me to stop, take a breath, and figure out, where really do I need to move forward in order for my business to be more successful. And that strategic pause, if you will, that I was forced to take actually turned out to be a turning point in my company, because when I was able to go back on the offensive, my company was much more successful than it had ever been before, and in many ways was more successful than I thought it was ever going to be. So it would have been better, I think, if I had recognized the value of retreating perhaps a little bit earlier. I wouldn't have gotten in such a deep hole as the result of a recession. But in any event, this question of, when do we advance, when do we retreat? These are the kind of factors that we need to take into account as we evaluate our strategic options. And again, they come down to the morale of our people. What real opportunity are we being presented with as we confront our enemy or our market? It doesn't have, we don't have to militarize, the business world quite so much. And what are the inherent risks in continuing to move forward in terms of future progress? Do we get ourselves to the point where we're just so exhausted, so beaten up, that we won't be able to take take advantage of future opportunities? Or do we see an opportunity to, double down and therefore really make a tremendous leap forward, even if it comes at some significant cost, but nonetheless, we're able to meet this strategic objective. And then, after we've met that objective, we can pause and we don't have to retreat. So that is the lesson of the Foch at the Marne, the miracle of the Marne. And I invite your thoughts, your comments on today's show. Always interested to hear what you have to say, and you can post that in our social media. You'll see links to that in the show notes after this episode posts. So thank you very, very much for joining me today. Tomorrow at 10 a.m. Pacific time is my show, People Making Money. I'm going to be talking about writing a book, why you might want to write a book, what you should write it about, and how you can write it in a way that will be most effective and efficient for your business or practice. So do please join me then. And then we'll be back next week on Monday at 10 a.m. with my show, Trusts and Estates Weekly, and the regular schedule. And next week on Thursday, I want to highlight this. This is our new show. Thursdays at 5 p.m. Pacific time every other week is Jiggers's Place. And we talk about all things not related to business and professions. So we're going to be talking about on Thursday of next week, behaviors that define a man. This is a subject very near to my heart, and you'll see. I'll be sharing some stories from my life on how I developed these ideas. So it's a time for us to relax as we head toward the end of the week. So just wanted to highlight our new show. So thanks again very much for joining me. Wishing you a wonderful rest of the day, and signing off. Marie, darling, you are my